is it?
Strategic thinking is really one dimension of strategy. So we have strategy, which is the big thing. And then what I have done is take a look at three different dimensions of strategy. One is strategic thinking, another is strategic planning, and another is strategic implementation. And I look at it based on the underlying cognitions or the kind of thinking that's required for each one. So strategic thinking tends to be the least studied and probably the most important of all the dimensions of strategy. And it's really about keeping a tight focus on the problem rather than jumping to a solution. Strategic planning, by contrast, tends to focus on the solution. So I think that's an important point of differentiation for anybody who's truly interested in strategic thinking. A second point about strategic thinking is that strategic thinking is an ongoing, continuous thing. You don't just sit down during strategy season and come up with strategic thinking. It's something that really goes on throughout the year. And a third point about strategic thinking is that the outcome is really a continuous process, whereas the outcome of a strategic plan is the product. It's the plan itself. So in a nutshell, that's a little 2 bits about strategic thinking.
Wow. So you recommend that strategic thinking should be used by everyone, every single time, every day, everywhere. You agree?
Pretty much. I like to say strategic thinking is kind of an anybody, anywhere, anytime kind of a thing. But having said that, it's not a blow off in terms of the underlying rigor and the deliberate practice that's really required of it, because it does take concentration. It really does take a very deliberate and a repetitive approach to learning it, like anything else. But truly, strategic thinking it often happens in odd places within an organization. Most of the time, it happens outside the four walls of a workplace. And it really, sometimes the very best strategic thinkers are people who have never had a seat at a strategy table. And I think this is one of the surprising things and probably one of the most amazing things about learning strategic thinking is that it's incredible who shows up as being really good strategic thinkers when you can really open it up.
Now, I just need your help because, we've trained all our teams on lateral thinking. We trained all our teams on once upon a time. BAD was a balanced scorecard. We trained them on the strategy map. They know how to do a great strategic plan. So now, why bring strategic thinking to the table? They already done all that.
I think this is a question. It's very, very valid because I think a lot of times people tend to approach strategic thinking in these little tiny increments. I think that when you bring together strategic thinking and lateral thinking, these two things fit together like a hand and a glove. So they meld together. There's so much overlap and also so much synthesizing that happens when you bring those two things together. So I think sometimes it can be hard to listen to people who say, well, we've learned strategic thinking. We took, 10 hours on strategic thinking and we took 12 hours on lateral thinking. Check. That's not at all what this is about. I say, if you've already done lateral thinking and balanced scorecard, you've probably got a leg up and a head start on a lot of people. And I think adding strategic thinking to that brings a broader context and a very highly relevant context to problems that we're all facing in strategy today. And that's looking, square in the face at complex problems.
Wow, that's another big wow, because I read in your book, you use this term irrational.
Yeah.
So what is irrational and how does it blend with our lateral thinking?
Well, lateral thinking draws very heavily on the irrational thinking domain, which is why I just love lateral thinking. thinking, because there's nothing that really supports the irrational concept of strategic thinking any more than lateral thinking does. But irrational thinking is really a kind of knowing. It's a way of knowing that's very different than rational thinking. And rational thinking, as we know, it's what we're all taught in formal education. It's very important. It's very necessary. It's the linear, logical, analytical, reductionist type of thinking that we're all taught. It's taught in a straight line thinking. Irrational thinking is another way of knowing. It's another way of making meaning. And it uses very, very different types of thinking. It uses intuition. It uses emotion. It uses imagination. It uses conceptual thinking. And it tends to work very well when we're in a state of imbalance or disorientation. This goes right back to complex problems again, because complex problems tend to put us into a state of disequilibrium or a state of imbalance. So I think anybody who is really determined to become a really first-rate strategist really needs to be very, very adept at rational thinking and irrational thinking. And I think, if you can find a way to really take and study lateral thinking and strategic thinking and pull these two together, it really paying attention to it and really practicing to it, you've just got a real leg up.
I've got to be honest, I've got difficult people in my organization. The CFO types in my organization ask for return on investment. So for every dollar spent, they want something measurable, And I've got tight training budgets. So the reason I could sell them lateral was because, I was giving them plethora of solutions to problems. Now you're telling me with strategic thinking, they're not going to get any solutions. So how am I going to demonstrate return on investment for a program of this nature?
Yeah, that's a really tough question. And to be honest, I struggle with that as well. The part of it that I really struggle with is our dependency, probably an over-dependency on tangible, measurable, concrete things as an outcome. Because I think when we put strategic thinking into a little bit broader perspective, it falls into that category of some of the most important critical aspects of a business. And many things about running a business that are the most critical are not tangible items. And these are some of the things that they take a lot of time. They take a lot of time to learn. They're often kind of invisible to other people. I think the question is really about, why are we so stuck on the only things that are important are tangible items? So with strategic thinking, one of the things that you can do, one of the things that I have done, is kind of break it down into what are some of the tangible things that can, in fact, have metrics applied to them, and what are some of the intangible things that I think are much, much, much more important, but you really have to pay attention to them and step back and look at them in a broad perspective. So some of the tangible things, I'm going to look here at a list of things that I jotted down as some tangible ROIs, are increased participation. And this, again, is assuming that you have a critical mass who are really skilled in strategic thinking and lateral thinking. You can't just have a smattering of people kind of anywhere in the organization. You really do need to have a critical mass, and it really does need to become embedded within the organization in order to have any sort of metrics become reliable. So increased participation is something that I think you can reasonably expect to see. More diverse and more inclusive participation is something also that, a lot of times we need to take a look at who's included in our current strategy sessions. And I think it's very, very quick turnaround to be able to measure and to see that strategic thinking, when it's paired with lateral thinking, is going to give a pretty quick uptick on that. It increases engagement, the perception of engagement. So those two things are really important. It tends to generate more and better ideas. It ultimately tends to result in more decisions and better decisions in terms of the quality of ideas, and a shorter turnaround time for strategic implementation, simply because more people have been involved in the process. So those are some things in terms of tangible items that you can put metrics around. I think in terms of intangibles, which I think when we're looking looking at complex problems and long-term impact on strategic thinking, I think some intangibles that I hear all the time that are even more important is confidence amongst leadership, that giving people a little bit of knowledge and giving people tons of practice really elevates their confidence in terms of being able to put this stuff to practice, being able to be used and seen and respected as role models. So confidence is a big one. Courage is another one. I think when people have the knowledge and they have the confidence, they're going to have the courage to really use strategic thinking in their day-to-day activities, and that they really will take the courage to ask some difficult questions that maybe have gotten shelved in the past. Another intangible that I hear all the time is that it's increased trust amongst people. And I think that comes from the fact that we're pulling people in who don't normally get included in strategy conversations. And that just pulling people in gives people a sense of contribution. And this increases, again, confidence. It increases trust. And another intangible is loyalty to the organization. When people feel that they've been included in something as important as strategic thinking conversations. Another intangible that I hear all the time is that around team building and team trust is elevated when everybody has the same knowledge base and is working towards skills for developing strategic thinking. Flexibility and adaptability, again, intangibles, but those are important things that get elevated with strategic thinking. So I think the whole idea of dividing it into tangibles and intangibles can be helpful sometimes for people to understand in terms of short-term and long-term benefits.
Very impressive. One thing that I take away with what you just said is good strategic thinking will make both strategic planning and strategic implementation cool, breeze, easy go, because the teams are now trained on thinking better. So the action planning is going to be better. The implementation is going to be better. I see that.
And that's so well said, Sunil. That's just so well said, because, if we look at the three dimensions of a strategy, strategic thinking, strategic planning, and strategic implementation, there's tons and tons of resources that are poured into strategic planning and strategic implementation. But there's very, very little that's put into strategic thinking. And when you look at the returns in terms of successful strategic implementations, it's bleak. It's pitiful. It's terrible. And I think when people can begin to put their efforts into strategic thinking and know that they can utilize that any point in the year, they're going to get a much better strategic plan, and they're going to up their chances of getting successful implementation. Yeah.
How do we keep this fire on? The pot's on the boil. They come for the 2-day training. They're all gung-ho, they're fully charged. Yeah, they're loving the tools. They're loving the 5 critical qualities to be a good strategic thinker. They're loving all of that. They're loving surf and dive. They're into it. But when they go back to work, it's all kind of fizzled out. So how do you make it sustainable?
Yeah.
How do you make strategic thinking a habit?
This, I think, is like any other habit. When we talked about for strategic thinking, we're really using more than what we're using the rational domain. And so it's like anything else. It really, A, requires knowledge, okay? And B, it requires a lot of practice. And it requires repetition. It requires starting a new habit like anything else. So this requires, I find, it really requires support from senior leadership in terms of why are we focusing on strategic thinking? Okay, we've got 10 courses on strategic planning and 20 on implementation, and we're still not, headed in the direction we want to go. So I think it's clear that people understand that this is not, to be honest, I don't even always use the word training, because I think it's more a facilitated learning experience that needs to be attended to after the formal gathering, whether it's online or whether it's offline. I think there also needs to be a critical mass of people within an organization that understand the 3 domains of strategy and what they are, what the difference is, so that people can really support each other. And as they're learning, they can kind of, plug in the gaps for each other. So I I think really facilitating the learning of a critical mass is important. I also think it's very helpful to have leaders at every level of the organization who really do get this, who can role model it through daily practice and asking those good questions. That takes courage, and it tends to change the culture of an organization. So I think it's also important in terms of developing a critical mass to really aim for embedding strategic thinking within the culture of the organization, because that's the only way that you're going to give emphasis to it that is necessary for really allowing the time to practice it to a degree that it does become a new habit. And the last thing that I'd like to add to is I think that leaders at all levels need to realize they need to have a structured and a very deliberate approach to teaching strategic thinking, that it can't, even though it tends to happen informally, there's a structured approach around it that people need to get so that they can pay attention and so that they can, nab informal strategic thinking practices when they occur. So I think it can't be approached as just kind of another training that we just kind of tick off our list. I think it really needs to be seen very seriously as a development initiative that's going to take some time and some commitment.
So one last question. Imagine you're in a giant-sized elevator with the Fortune 5 CEOs, and you're going to make an elevator pitch. Why strategic thinking? So what would be that pitch?
Oh, boy. I would say strategic thinking is kind of your lifeline to the future, if you ask me, about dealing with real strategic issues in today's environment. Because if you have more than a hope and a prayer of really setting a direction in the environment in which we're all tasked with making strategy, which is crazy, it's, rapidly changing, it's constantly changing, highly volatile, you really do need an approach that includes the irrational as well as the rational dimensions of strategy. So I would say, if you're interested in more than a hope and a prayer, you need to really get serious about at least considering what is strategic thinking, what isn't strategic thinking, and how can it really help us as a company to really set the direction and move forward. Another thing I would say in a long elevator ride is just sort of a recap that setting strategy is the number one key area of responsibility for a leader. I would be curious as to what you're doing to develop that within your own company. And that would probably be about the time the elevator doors would open.
So we were in wonderful conversation with Dr. Julia Sloan, and thank you for this enlightenment about strategic thinking.
Thank you, Sunil.